And next, Ron Hoffer is, he's Environment and Water Advisor in the World Bank's Europe and Central Asia region. He chaired the session on national governments, climate change, and EIA beyond North America. So, Ron?
Hi. After we got around the fact that we were going beyond North America but covering Canada, we forgot the topic and just went on with what we had structured. Basically, we had a slightly different format. We had a presentation by Shardul Agrawala, who was one of the lead authors of this very interesting OECD document, which was looking at incorporating climate change impacts and adaptation in EIAs. And I do urge you to take a look at this. This is a question of whether you're going to be a glass is half full or half empty. It shows which countries and multilateral development banks have the intention to do EIA and adaptation. You see the list is not too big. It's about 13 entities. It gets smaller on guidance, where they provided guidance, and it's tiny when it gets to implementation. Yet despite this sobering item, it also shows, again, I think, consistently where one can get in the process, where EIA professionals can make a difference in the EIA process to incorporate climate. That presentation was given, and then we had a reaction by three representatives of national government, the UK on water, Australia on agriculture, and the Netherlands on the EIA process, and then a response back from the International Network for Compliance and Enforcement. I brought up, and again, in deference to my colleagues, I had a little bit more time to draw some conclusions from those talks. And so there were 7 points I walked away with. First is some developed countries are rich with data. They're rich with climate projections. They have development scenarios. They have institutes doing this work. And it's very helpful when you want to get on thorough project, you want to look at a thorough analysis, you want to manage uncertainty in major projects where you have a timeline to do the analysis. It's really good to do that. And it's probably more than we expected. But second is even those places, having the work already in place is far more effective than starting from the beginning. As someone said, if you have to have a development scenario and climate models generated for every project, you're out of luck. Even in a place like the UK or the Netherlands or Australia, you really need to have these in place. Of course, that sets a fairly high bar. And so, but, you know, despite being, you can be, again, a little bit depressed on this. Why do we need all this data? But, you know, while every project has its context and every project needs customization, I think what we also walked away is there are already pragmatic and comparatively simple rules of thumb or ways forward to get you going in this process. For example, in the UK, if I remember, there was a mention of a 20% increase in runoff as taken as a factor in certain water planning projects. Despite all the analysis, let's use 20%, it can get us going. And I think Rob from the Netherlands gave some really good, you know, simple 3 to 4 steps that you can do in the logic process in the Netherlands EIA to incorporate mitigation and adaptation, again, without having to be so hung up on having all the models. And you can make quick gains in understanding about leaders. Fourth point I walked away with, it's not just about climate analysis and modeling as we see in, it's not just a bunch of scientists getting around and saying which GCMs and which, you know, hydrologic model you link it to. Because in Australia, the representative from Australia said that, listen, you know, we already know enough to say that adaptation planning in the agricultural sector is needed. And we're already working on better farm planning, business development, community social support, because the more rural people will need it. And we also know where we need to put research. So they're going ahead again on that, regardless of whether you have the good models or not. Fifth point that was raised is, while this group really is focused on EIA practitioners and we need to do better applied science, we must recognize that without compliance and enforcement by government, guidance documents are just words on paper. You know, unless there's someone saying, hey, are you following that management plan that included climate? If you're not following that management plan, you know, it's not going to go. I mean, we all are well-meaning professionals, but well-meaning professionals don't necessarily make the difference in the 70% of the world that maybe doesn't feel that they need to follow well-meaning professionals. A little bit of help from compliance and enforcement is needed. 2 last points. One is experience in developing countries, as expected, is less advanced than in developed countries. So we had a couple of examples of that. Capacity building is of course needed, but ensuring that the countries have sufficient basic data on weather and climate trends is more important, and that's where outside support is needed and warranted rather than necessarily building a lot of models. And in the end, if I might again continue to paraphrase and probably misquote Rob from the Netherlands, I came away with the quote of the process is more than just providing information. It's about engaging in dialogue and helping influence decisions. So again, thanks to the presenters and discussants and the audience in our session.
I like the presentation of the 7 points, and I'm sure will generate some discussion. Next, we have Michael Smith, and Michael is Senior Manager with ICF International, and he specializes in providing project management and overall NEPA compliance review for large and complex projects. And he is the session. Remind me which session it is.
Bilateral donors and integration of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change policies.
Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, great. And we had 3 presenters, kind of a standard structure for our presentation. I'll go a little closer here. And I think the overall message, these were 3 different United States aid assistance loan agencies. And I think one of the interesting things was the integration of policies, particularly on the greenhouse gas emission side, both in terms of requirements for threshold levels and levels of emissions, and then also in terms of analysis and how that's sort of fed back into the impact assessment process and the effect that that's had. And I'll say a little bit more about that with each of the presenters. Our first presenter was Diane Brown from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And just a few highlights from her presentation. Her organization has about a $13 billion portfolio, projects in 150 different countries, so obviously quite large. They have a relatively new policy that began in 2007 on greenhouse gas emissions and also clean energy and renewable energy. And part of that policy is to set an annual cap of the projects that they would assist of a little bit over 1.3 million metric tons annually of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's tied into some larger goals also where their overall portfolio of projects, they have a goal to reduce the total amount. They have a baseline level of about 50 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So they have a goal to reduce that by about 30% by the year 2018 and about 50% by the year 2023. And so obviously some pretty aggressive goals for that. What's interesting is since the implementation of this project, what they found is not solely because of this policy, but certainly partly responsible that the sort of traditional thermal power generating plant applications to them have pretty much reduced to about 0. Part of that, of course, is that level of about 1.3 million metric tons doesn't get you a very large, certainly coal-fired power plant. So that certainly had an effect for them in sort of the portfolio of projects that they're seeing as well. Our second presenter, Stephen Parsons, was from the Export-Import Bank of the United States. And he spoke of a similar but certainly somewhat different policy. They actually have had, I found this interesting, in greenhouse gas emissions related policy going back to 1999. But starting last year, they had what he described as sort of a step up in the implementation of that, kind of some more teeth to the policy. And as part of that, they have both an overall carbon policy and then an implementation plan more recently for that. And I found one interesting aspect of that is they create a 2-tiered system for how they'll evaluate the projects related to the carbon intensity of the different projects. Again, many of these are power generation projects, but not all of them. And so they have thresholds that are set for those evaluations, and it sort of triggers both, if you fall into the high carbon intensity class of projects, it both triggers more intensive evaluation, both from an impact assessment side as well as just a pure greenhouse gas emission side, but also may trigger mitigation offsets and other requirements as well. And finally, Stephen described one project that is before them now, which I found pretty fascinating. He described it as what might be, and I think I might agree, if not the largest, one of the largest single power plant projects sort of being proposed right now in South Africa. It's a 4,800 megawatt, both in terms of its generating capacity and in terms of its projected greenhouse gas emissions, both from the emissions to the plant itself as well as the mining associated with it, of about 30 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. So again, compared to Diane's 1.3 million, sort of annual limit, pretty amazingly large project to evaluate. So that's one that they're running through their process, as I understand it right now. And then finally, we had Ben Campbell from the Millennium Challenge Corporation speak on a little bit different aspect. They're an organization dating back to the Bush administration in 2004, and they have very specific sort of poverty reduction goals in their assistance. It's also tied to objectives and criteria for improving performance on a whole set of criteria. But Ben mostly spoke, rather than on the greenhouse gas emission side, but rather relating more to the portfolio of the work that his agency deals with, relating to climate change impacts and studying those impacts on the projects themselves, as well as on the resources that they're evaluating, and talked a little bit about some of the challenges as they begin to do that analysis, as we've heard from a lot of the presenters at this conference over the last 2 days, and some unique challenges that his group has found, particularly in relation to countries that have a very wide-ranging capacity to do those impact analyses themselves, both just in terms of the impact analysis in general, but especially in trying to now add on this sort of new area of somehow addressing climate change impacts within impact assessment, even though the countries themselves, many of them, as he described, very, very concerned about the issue, but don't necessarily have the capacity to actually analyze it and consider it and deal with it in their impact assessment process. And then also, and lastly, the unique nature of MCC funding is a 5-year commitment of funding, and so dealing with obviously a much longer range problem like climate change and dealing it within a term of a 5-year kind of time horizon is certainly a big challenge that they face. So I want to thank all the presenters for a real excellent set of presentations.